For more than 260 years, a single family ruled the largest and most populous empire on earth. The House of Asingyoro, the Manchu dynasty that history remembers as the Qing, governed a domain that stretched from the frozen forests of Manchuria to the deserts of Central Asia, from the highlands of Tibet to the rice terraces of the tropical south. At its height, the Qing Empire ruled over roughly 400 million people, nearly a third of all humanity alive at the time, and 10 emperors sat upon the dragon throne before the final one was even born. They commanded the Forbidden City, a walled palace of 9,000 rooms where the emperor was addressed as the Son of Heaven, a figure believed to stand between the mortal world and the heavens. His color was a shade of yellow no other person in the empire could wear. His face could not be looked upon directly, and his very name was too sacred to be spoken aloud. For 2,000 years, the institution he embodied had endured longer than any comparable system of government in human history. Emperors had risen and fallen, dynasties had replaced dynasties, but the throne itself, the idea of a single heavenly ruler over all under heaven, had always survived. And then, in the space of a few short years, it was gone. Not just the empire. The very idea of an emperor was abolished, declared a relic, swept into the past. The last man to hold the title would spend his life being crowned and uncrowned 3 separate times. He would go from a god-king worshipped by millions to a prisoner, to a puppet, to a convicted war criminal, and finally to a gardener tending flower beds in a public park in Beijing, unrecognized by the people passing him on the street. His wife would die alone and forgotten in a prison cell. And this is the part almost nobody talks about because the fall of the last dynasty of China is not the story most people think it is. So let me take you through what actually happened to China's royal family after their empire collapsed, because the truth is stranger, sadder, and far more human than the legend that surrounds it. To understand how far this family fell, you first have to understand the height from which they came. The Qing Dynasty was not Chinese in origin, it was Manchu, founded by a people from the northeast who seized Beijing in 1644, replacing the collapsing Ming. Under emperors like Kangxi and Qianlong in the 17th and 18th centuries, the empire reached a golden age. Its borders swelled to nearly their greatest extent. Its economy was among the largest in the world, and its porcelain, silk, and tea were coveted across every continent. The emperor presided over a court of dazzling ritual, governed by rules of etiquette so intricate they took a lifetime to master. This was an empire that genuinely believed itself to be the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom, to which all other nations were expected to send tribute. But by the 19th century, that confidence had curdled into something dangerous. The world outside had changed, and the Qing had not. When British warships arrived to force open Chinese markets for the opium trade, the empire discovered that its armies, so fearsome on paper, were no match for industrial gunboats. The Opium Wars were a humiliation, followed by a cascade of what the Chinese would call the unequal treaties, agreements signed at gunpoint, that carved away Chinese sovereignty piece by piece. Then came the Taiping Rebellion, a civil war of almost unimaginable scale that left tens of millions dead and nearly toppled the dynasty from within. The Qing survived, but it was bleeding, weakened, and increasingly seen by its own people as unable to protect them. At the center of this slow collapse stood one of the most formidable figures of the age, the Empress Dowager Siakai, a former concubine who had risen to become the true power behind the throne. Siakai dominated Chinese politics for nearly half a century, ruling through a succession of emperors she could control. When the young Guangxu emperor attempted a sweeping modernization in 1898, CIC placed him under house arrest and reversed nearly everything he had done. The emperor spent the rest of his life a prisoner in his own palace, a hollow figurehead, and it was into this dying court, this world of intrigue and decay, that the last emperor was born. His name was Puyi. He came into the world in 1906, the son of a Manchu prince. Then, in November of 1908, everything changed in the space of a single day. The imprisoned Guangxu emperor died suddenly. The cause was never fully explained at the time, though studies of his remains a century later would reveal something startling, that his body contained a fatal dose of arsenic. He had been poisoned, and the very next day, the woman who had ruled China for decades, the Empress Dowager Cixi herself, also died. In 48 hours, the two most powerful figures in the empire were gone. Before her death, Cixi had named the successor. The new emperor of China would be a boy not yet 3 years old, Puyi. The story of how they came for him is genuinely haunting. Soldiers and eunuchs arrived at the family mansion to take the toddler away from his mother, to install him in the Forbidden City as the Son of Heaven. The child screamed and clung to his nurse, terrified of the strangers surrounding him. He did not want to be emperor, he wanted to go home. But there was no home to go back to anymore. He was carried into the vast, cold palace, dressed in robes of imperial yellow, and placed upon the dragon throne. At his coronation, held in the freezing cold, the little boy sobbed and struggled while his father knelt beside him, whispering that it would soon be over. The assembled officials took this as a terrible omen, and they were right. Puyi would be the last person ever to sit on that throne as the ruler of an empire. He grew up in a gilded prison, a small boy, surrounded by 1,000 servants who obeyed his every whim, raised by eunuchs and cut off almost entirely from the outside world and from his own family. He was, by his own later account, a spoiled and lonely child, an absolute monarch in miniature who could order a servant beaten on a passing impulse, yet had no real power over anything that mattered. Because outside the red walls of the Forbidden City, the empire he supposedly ruled was already coming apart. The unraveling came fast. In October of 1911, an uprising broke out in the city of Wuchang, sparked almost by accident when a bomb went off prematurely in a revolutionary hideout. What might have been a minor incident instead lit a fuse across the entire country. Province after province declared independence from the Qing, calling for a republic. The revolution was led in spirit by Sun Yat-sen, a physician who had spent years in exile organizing against the imperial system. The court, desperate, turned to the one man it believed could save it, an ambitious general named Yuan Shikai, who commanded the most modern army in China. But Yuan had ambitions of his own. Rather than crush the revolution, he brokered a deal, negotiating with the revolutionaries and the court at once, positioning himself as the indispensable man in the middle. Sun Yat-sen agreed to step aside and let Yuan become the first president of the new Republic of China, on the condition that Yuan secure the emperor's abdication. And so the pressure fell upon the imperial court, and specifically upon the woman now responsible for the child emperor, the Empress Dowager Longyu. On the 12th of February 1912, she signed the document that historians simply call the Abdication Edict. Puyi, who was 5 years old, was not consulted. He was not even told what was happening. He would later write that his daily routine did not change at all, that no one bothered to explain to a small boy that he was no longer the emperor of anything. With the stroke of a brush, the Qing Dynasty ended, and with it an institution older than the Roman Empire. But here's where the story takes its first strange turn, the detail that sets the entire tragedy in motion. Puyi was not simply thrown out. As part of the abdication, the new republic agreed to a remarkable arrangement called the Articles of Favorable Treatment. Under its terms, the boy would keep his imperial title. He would continue to live inside the Forbidden City, treated almost as a foreign monarch on Chinese soil, receiving an enormous annual subsidy of 4 million silver dollars from the republic's treasury, his court of eunuchs and servants intact. In effect, a tiny fossilized empire was preserved in amber in the heart of Beijing, a phantom court with a child emperor who ruled over nothing but a palace, surrounded by the crumbling rituals of a world that no longer existed. And so Puyi grew up in an impossible situation, an emperor without an empire, a god-king, whose kingdom had shrunk to a handful of courtyards. Beyond his walls, China descended into the chaos of the warlord era as rival generals carved the country into competing fiefdoms after Yuan Shikai's death in 1916. In 1917, a Qing loyalist general named Zhang Xun marched his troops into Beijing and, for a giddy 12 days, restored the 11-year-old Puyi to the throne, declaring the empire reborn. The restoration collapsed almost immediately, bombed from the air by rival forces and abandoned by everyone. The boy was uncrowned for the second time in his young life. Around this time, a figure entered his world who would shape him profoundly, a Scottish scholar named Reginald Johnston, hired as his tutor. Johnston taught the young emperor English, gave him the English name Henry, and became something close to a father figure to a boy who had almost never known genuine affection. Under his influence, Puyi developed a fascination with the modern world beyond his walls. He installed a telephone. He cut off his long imperial queue of hair, scandalizing his court. He took to wearing Western suits and spectacles and dreamed of traveling to Oxford. He was, in a sense, pressing his face against the glass of a world he could see but was not permitted to enter. In 1922, following imperial tradition, the 16-year-old was married. He was presented with photographs of eligible young women, and by his own account could barely tell them apart, choosing almost at random. His empress was a young woman named Wanrong, intelligent, beautiful, educated, and Western-leaning, from a prominent Manchu family. But the marriage was, from the beginning, a hollow thing. Puyi showed little interest in his wife, and the union produced no children. It never would. The last emperor of China would die without a single direct heir, a fact that hangs over this entire story. Then, in the autumn of 1924, the fragile bubble finally burst. A warlord named Feng Yusheng, who controlled Beijing at that moment, decided the continued existence of an emperor in the Forbidden City was an offense to the Republic and a convenient way to boost his own popularity. On the 5th of November, his soldiers surrounded the palace. Feng unilaterally tore up the Articles of Favorable Treatment, stripped Puyi of his imperial title, reduced him to an ordinary citizen, and gave him just hours to leave the only home he had ever known. The 18-year-old former emperor was escorted out, and the gates closed behind him. The Phantom Empire, preserved for 12 years past its own death, was finally and truly over, And now Puyi was something new and dangerous, a deposed monarch with no throne, no country, and no protection, adrift in a China torn apart by competing armies. He fled first to his father's mansion, then, fearing for his safety, to the Japanese legation in Beijing, and in that decision lay the seeds of the greatest catastrophe of his life, because the Japanese saw in this stateless young man something enormously valuable, a legitimate emperor they could one day use. From Beijing, Puyi moved to Tianjin, into the Japanese-controlled concession, where he set up a small court in a villa and lived for the next 7 years in a strange limbo of exiled luxury. He and Wanrong wore the finest Western fashions, danced at parties, bought imported cars and pianos. He signed his letters as an emperor still, but beneath the glamour he was consumed by one obsession, the dream of restoration, of reclaiming the throne his family had lost. It was a dream that made him desperately, dangerously vulnerable to anyone who promised to help him fulfill it. That desperation would deliver him into the worst possible hands. In September of 1931, the Japanese army engineered an incident in Manchuria, the ancestral homeland of Puyi's own Manchu dynasty, and used it as a pretext to invade and occupy the entire region. Now they needed a face to place on their conquest, a way to disguise a naked land grab as a legitimate new state. They needed an emperor, and they had one waiting in Tianjin. Japanese agents approached Puyi with an intoxicating offer, to come to Manchuria and be a ruler once more. Against the frantic warnings of some of his own advisors, who saw exactly what was happening, Puyi could not resist. The chance to undo the humiliation of his expulsion was more than he could refuse. In secret, he was smuggled north. In 1932, the Japanese proclaimed the new state of Manchukuo, with Puyi installed first as its chief executive and then, in 1934, crowned as its emperor under a new reign name. For the third time in his life, Puyi wore an imperial crown, and for the third time, it was an illusion. He quickly discovered that he was a prisoner in a golden cage, an emperor with no power whatsoever. Every decision was made by his Japanese handlers, his guards, his advisors, his ministers, all answered to Tokyo, not to him. The documents he signed were placed before him already decided. He had traded one gilded prison for another, except this one made him complicit in the brutal occupation of his own country, a puppet whose strings were pulled by the very empire that was, at that moment, waging a devastating war against the Chinese people. The years in Manchukuo hollowed him out. He grew paranoid and fearful, despised by his own countrymen as a collaborator and a traitor, and the human cost within his own family was severe. His empress, Wanrong, had descended into a profound crisis. Isolated and trapped in the same golden cage, she had become addicted to opium, an addiction the Japanese reportedly did nothing to discourage, since it kept her compliant. Over the years, she deteriorated into a ghost of the vibrant young woman she had once been, drifting through the palace in a haze, her mind increasingly unmoored from reality. It is one of the quietest tragedies of this whole story, a young empress who had once dreamed of the modern world slowly disappearing inside a puppet court, abandoned by almost everyone around her. Meanwhile, Puyi's younger brother, Puji, had become entangled in the Japanese design. Sent to Japan to study at a military academy, he was married, in an arrangement encouraged by the Japanese, to a Japanese noblewoman named Hiro Saga, a relative of the imperial family in Tokyo. The marriage had a chilling logic behind it. Since Puyi had no children, any child of Puji and his Japanese wife would stand in line to inherit the throne of Manchukuo, a half-Japanese heir who would bind the puppet state ever more tightly to Tokyo. The whole family had become pieces on a board controlled by others. Then, in August of 1945, the world that had trapped Puyi collapsed. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and poured its armies into Manchuria, and within days the Japanese occupation disintegrated. Puyi hastily abdicated his Manchukuo throne, the second abdication of his life, and attempted to flee to Japan by airplane. He made a fateful decision in those final chaotic hours. He fled with the men of his court and left the women behind, including his broken empress, Wanrong. At a small airfield, waiting for a plane toward an escape that never came, he was captured by Soviet troops. And what happened to Wanrong after he abandoned her is almost unbearable to recount. Left behind in the collapse, she and other members of the household attempted to flee south but were captured by Chinese communist guerrillas early in 1946. The former Empress of China, still in the grip of her opium addiction and now cut off from any supply, was thrown into captivity. According to the accounts that survive, including the memoir of her sister-in-law who was imprisoned alongside her, Wanrong spent her final months in horrifying conditions, suffering the agonies of withdrawal, her mind slipping away. She sometimes believed she was back in the Forbidden City, issuing commands to guards who only laughed at her. Moved from place to place and growing weaker, she was eventually left behind when other prisoners were relocated. In June of 1946, Wanrong died in a cell in the town of Yanji, alone, malnourished and stripped of every shred of the dignity she had been born into. She was 39 years old. Her body was never recovered. To this day, no one knows where the last Empress of China is buried. Decades later, her brother would hold a symbolic funeral for her, burying nothing but her memory. Puyi, meanwhile, had vanished into the Soviet Union. For 5 years he was held prisoner in Siberia, treated, by the standards of what was to come, relatively comfortably, and he grew to dread the day he might be sent home. He wrote letters begging Stalin to let him stay, terrified of what the Chinese communists would do to him. In 1946, he was brought to Tokyo to testify at the International War Crimes Tribunal, where he spoke for 8 days, denouncing the Japanese and insisting he had been nothing but their unwilling puppet. It was partly true and partly a performance to save his own life, and he would later admit that he had concealed some of the truth about his own willing collaboration in order to protect himself. Then, in 1950, the moment he had feared arrived. The Soviets handed him over to the newly established People's Republic of China. The last emperor was now in the hands of Mao Zedong's government, a prisoner accused of treason and war crimes, expecting to be executed. But he was not executed, and this is perhaps the most extraordinary turn in his life. Rather than kill him, the communist government decided to do something almost unheard of in the history of fallen monarchs. It would attempt to remake him. Puyi was sent to a war criminals management center in Fushun, where he spent nearly a decade undergoing what the government called re-education. For a man who had spent his entire life being dressed by servants, who had literally never tied his own shoes, the experience was a total transformation. He was made to fold his own clothes, to grow vegetables, to live alongside the very Manchukuo officials who had once served under him. Whether his conversion was genuine or simply the desperate adaptation of a man who had spent his whole life bending to whatever power held him, historians still debate. But something in him did seem to change. The absolute monarch, the puppet, the prisoner, slowly became something he had never been in his life, an ordinary man. In 1959, on the personal order of Mao Zedong, Puyi was pardoned and released. He returned to Beijing, the city where he had once been worshipped as a living god, and he was given a job. He worked first as a gardener at the Beijing Botanical Gardens, tending plants with his own hands, and later as an archivist in a government office. He lived in an ordinary residence and rode the public bus. There is something almost impossible to comprehend in the image of it. A man who had been the son of heaven, who had sat upon the dragon throne of an empire of 400 million souls, now watering flowers in a public park where the citizens strolling past had no idea who he was. In 1962, he married for the final time to a hospital nurse named Li Shokshan, and by most accounts this last marriage brought him a measure of quiet contentment he had never known in all his years of imperial grandeur. He wrote his memoirs, a remarkable document in which the last emperor reflected on his own strange journey from god-king to citizen. But his peace did not last. In 1966, the Cultural Revolution erupted across China, a violent convulsion in which anything associated with the old world was attacked with ferocious zeal. Puyi, the ultimate symbol of the old order, became frightened for his safety once more, and reportedly required a measure of official protection to keep the young radicals from turning on him. He did not have long to endure it. His health, worn down by a lifetime of upheaval, was failing. On the 17th of October 1967, Puyi died in Beijing of kidney cancer and related complications. He was 61 years old. The last emperor of China died a private citizen, and in accordance with the law, his body was cremated, his ashes placed in a public revolutionary cemetery, alongside ordinary party members and officials, with nothing to mark him as anything other than one more citizen of the People's Republic. It was, in its way, the final uncrowning. But the story of the family did not end with his ashes. In a strange epilogue that speaks to how much China itself had changed, Puyi's remains would not stay in that public cemetery. In the mid-1990s, nearly 30 years after his death, his widow arranged for his ashes to be moved to a privately owned commercial cemetery built near the Western Qing Tombs, the Grand Imperial Mausoleum complex about 75 miles from Beijing, where 4 of the emperors who came before him lie buried in tombs of stone and marble. The cemetery's owners, understanding the value of having a genuine emperor among their residents, welcomed him. And so the last son of heaven, who had died a gardener, was at last laid to rest near the tombs of his ancestors, not by the decree of an empire, but as part of a business arrangement. Even in death, Puyi occupied the same impossible space he had lived in his entire life, suspended between emperor and commoner, belonging fully to neither world. As for the rest of the family, the house of Ising-Giro did not vanish. Puyi's younger brother, Puja, the one who had been groomed as a potential heir, survived the wars and the revolution and, like his brother, was imprisoned and then eventually released and reintegrated into the new China. He was reunited with his Japanese wife, Hirosaga, after years of forced separation, one of the few genuine love stories to emerge from all this wreckage, and lived quietly in Beijing until his death in 1994. With no surviving son, and with Puyi childless, the headship of the imperial house passed sideways to a younger half-brother who had taken the ordinary Chinese surname Jin, meaning gold, a quiet echo of the Manchu clan name Aishin, which carried the same meaning. That is the pattern the whole family followed, exchanging their grand imperial identity for ordinary names and ordinary lives, becoming teachers, painters, calligraphers, and historians, folding themselves into the vast population of modern China. Today, the descendants of the Gioro clan number in the thousands, scattered across China and beyond. Some have quietly embraced their heritage as the country's attitude toward its imperial past has softened, painting in the classical style their ancestors patronized, or speaking to historians about a vanished world. Others have set the past aside entirely, living lives utterly disconnected from the throne their family once held. The Forbidden City, where Puyi wept as a toddler on his coronation day, is now one of the most visited museums on Earth. Its courtyards filled each day with tourists photographing the empty dragon throne, most of them unaware that the last man to sit on it ended his days pulling weeds in a public garden across the city. When you step back and look at the full arc of it, the fall of China's royal family stands almost alone among the collapses of the great dynasties. The Romanovs of Russia were murdered in a cellar. The Habsburgs of Austria lost their empire but kept their wealth. The Ottomans were exiled en masse and scattered across the world. But the Qing experienced something stranger than exile or execution. Their last emperor was not killed, and he was not sent away. He was kept, remade, and reabsorbed, transformed by the state from a god into a citizen, made to live out his days in the very city where he had once been worshipped, an ordinary man in a Mao suit, a living monument to how completely the old world had been swept away. There is something in Puyi's story that reaches past politics and touches something deeply human. It is the story of a man who never once in his entire life got to choose his own fate. He did not choose to be taken from his mother at the age of 2. He did not choose to be enthroned, or dethroned, or restored, or dethroned again. He did not choose the Japanese who used him, or the Soviets who held him, or the re-education that remade him. From his first breath to his last, he was an instrument in the hands of others, picked up and put down as the great forces of the 20th century found him useful or discarded him, and perhaps that is the deepest tragedy of all. Not the loss of the empire, not the loss of the throne, but the loss of a single human life to the machinery of history. The imperial system that had governed China for 2,000 years ended not with a great battle, but with a signature on a document that a 5-year-old boy was never even shown. And the boy himself, the last of the sons of heaven, lived long enough to see the entire world he was born into vanish completely, and to become in the end exactly what the revolution had always insisted he should be, just a man, nothing more and nothing less. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel grow and lets me keep making these deep dives into the families that history swept aside. And I would love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Puyi was a villain, a victim, or simply a man trapped by forces far larger than himself? I will see you in the next one.